I used to think the technique of sewing on paper was totally out of reach unless you were a real sewist. As it turns out, you do need some thread and paper, but you don't actually need to know how to sew. Hello, I'm Christine. Welcome to my channel where I make cards and I sew, and I usually do both. This is my cat Wolfgang, he's helping today. If you're new to my channel, I am hoping to encourage you, if you're a sewist, to make cards, and if you make cards, to sew, and if you do neither, welcome. I hope to inspire you to do one of the two or both. A few years ago, I saw the trend of sewing along the borders of cards, and I thought it was the most beautiful thing I'd seen. But I didn't know how to sew, I didn't have a machine, and it just seemed like an impossible technique to master for a mere card maker like myself. As fate would have it, I actually found a used machine on the street, a vintage Singer sewing machine. And my aunt, who sews, told me to get it serviced because if you buy a used machine, if it hasn't been properly taken care of or if it hasn't been serviced in a while, you need to bring it in to make sure it's mechanically sound and get a checkup every so often. The first thing I had to learn was how to actually thread the machine. And this took longer than I would have liked, but once you know how to thread a machine, you can do it for life, and if you've got a machine you've never threaded, just look up your machine on YouTube and type in the keywords how to thread the machine as well as how to thread a bobbin. Once you've got all your threads in place and your paper with you, you're ready to go. I would recommend, if you're going to sew on paper, using a heavyweight cardstock, 110 pounds at the lightest. If you want to sew with vellum, you certainly can, but I would sew it on top of some heavyweight paper or even maybe pair it with fabric. But the heavier weight cardstock can really take the needle much better than a finer piece of paper that might get a little shreddy. If you've got a vintage machine like I do, chances are you've got straight stitch and you've got zigzag stitch, and that's pretty much all you've got. But you've got some options within those stitches. The length of your stitch can vary, and the narrowness of your zigzag versus how wide you want your zigzag stitch to be can also vary. And I'd encourage you to play around. The minute you got a machine and some thread and paper, go to town. And sewists, if you already know how to do this stuff, you're super ready to sew on paper, and I say we dive right into that. Today I'm working with a Christmas card. Yes, it is July, but Christmas in July is definitely a thing, at least in my world. And I started out wanting to sew a border along the inside of this card, a zigzag stitch. I had not properly wound the bobbin though, and it didn't catch in the way it was supposed to do in the machine. So what happened was my stitch around my card was super loose and kind of loopy, and it would be a disaster if I were sewing a garment, but because it's paper, it just adds character to the piece. So I left it, and today I'm just sewing another zigzag in contrast thread over it to give it even more flavor. I'm placing now my card under the machine, and I can see in that little space between my foot where my zigzag is going to be, and I'm just going to aim straight down the paper. You can look at the foot in relation to your paper as a guide when you sew along, or if you kind of go off course, you can trim your paper to match the stitch. In this case, the card was already made, so I sewed down as straight as I can, and here's a tip. When you're ready to pivot your border, just like you would on a garment, you lift up your presser foot with the needle still in the paper, and you pivot your paper around toward the path that you next want to come down with your stitch. And then you just continue all the way around the card as you see fit. And you can change your stitch halfway if you'd like to do that. This is your time to play around and be creative. Do what you want. I really want to emphasize this point here, and that is that you really cannot make a mistake when you're sewing on paper. If your stitch is too loose, if it's wavy, if you get a knot, if you've got like a big thread nest underneath the paper, all of these can be really beautiful elements if you're doing a mixed media card. If you're doing clean and simple, it's true you may want that very clean, straight stitch, and stitching on paper is a good way to practice straight lines. Without ruining a piece of fabric, I encourage you to just go nuts. Sewists, this is your time. This is your time to run wild, run free with your thread. You can do whatever you want and it will work out. You also don't need to keep to a border around a card. You can go within the card itself and do a little pattern, color that in later. You could sew a piece of fabric onto a piece of paper and then sew over the fabric. The world is truly your oyster here. The options are endless. Now there is one thing I do want to warn you about, and that is when you first start sewing on good heavy cardstock, you get kind of a little crunchy feeling that can be at first uncomfortable, and you think, oh no, can my machine handle it? Trust me, your machine can handle it. It will be fine, especially if you've got a vintage machine. That will sew through anything. But the more you sew through paper, do you know those cat videos where they've got their teeth crunching through cardboard? That's kind of the feeling you get only on hyperspeed when you're sewing a piece of paper, but don't let it throw you off at first. It's totally fine. Another good thing to know is that when you're starting your cards or finishing them off, you do not need to backstitch. All you do to start is go straight down your card, and when you're finished, you snip your threads, and that's it. You can leave them long if you like that look. You can tie them up in a little bow if you like that look, or you can crop them really close and just glue them on the back. Right, crafty friends, I hope you feel inspired to go try some paper sewing yourself. If you have any comments, please leave them below. If you have any questions, please leave them below. I'm always looking for a good crafty friend, so please stop by anytime and just say hi. And I enjoyed being with you here today. I hope to see you soon. Have fun in your craft room. Bye.